Ancient Rome at Flagler College. I wanted to take the opportunity in this first video lecture to talk about Roman sources. And this may seem like a strange way to begin a course, rather than just kind of letting the sources come to us as we proceed through a narrative. We're going to start by talking about these. And this discussion will encompass the entire period of study from the early part of the first millennium BCE to about the middle of the second millennium CE. The middle of the first millennium CE. About a little over 1,000 years of history. And the reason for this is that studying ancient history is very different from studying modern history. And if students are coming to this primarily having spent their time in modern history, are accustomed to perusing primary sources like newspapers or individual diaries or journals or letters or things like this, which even as early as the 17th or 18th century have survived in relative abundance. Studying ancient history is not like that. Not like that at all. Okay. The number of sources we have at our disposal is extremely small. The source material is finite. It is possible, and this, is one way to characterize it, one way to think about it. It is possible for a person, this would take a lot of years and a lot of reading, but possible for a person to have pretty good exposure, maybe even comprehensive exposure, to just about every major source from ancient Rome. And I cannot underscore this point enough, right? I have seen, students writing papers in Western Civ or in one of these classes I teach on ancient or medieval history about, say they're critiquing a study, a book or something like that, and saying, well, the author seems to only be using one or two sources. It would really be more responsible if the author could diversify the number of sources they're using. And, normally, especially if you're studying modern history, that would be an absolutely accurate thing to say. But when you're studying ancient history, it's likely that there is only one or two sources that address the historical events or historical circumstances that you might be worried about, okay, or interested in. And those sources may not be even ideal. They may not be direct, like eyewitness accounts or anything like that. And moreover, the truly kind of personal, individualized sorts of sources that we find in more recent times, things like personal letters, diaries, journals, memoirs, even things like autobiographies, those either didn't exist in the ancient world or they haven't survived. Okay, there are a couple of examples where someone writes a personal account of their own life. Maybe the most famous of these is the Confessions of St. Augustine, which is from the late 4th or early 5th century CE, so at the very end of our period, and that is a text that we may talk about toward the end of the term. But that is a unique document. You simply don't find many things, or really any things like that in the ancient world. And so one of the reasons that I assigned to you this essay on Roman sources was to give you a sense of what is available. One of the things that you should note from this, and this might be the number one observation, is that all of these written sources are composed by elites, people who had education, people who could write, which was a tiny, tiny fraction of the population, probably less than 10%, maybe less than 5% of the population of ancient Rome, or its surrounding area, its empire could write. Most people were peasants living in the countryside, farming, working, and some of them probably never saw a written document in their entire lives, or if they did, they may not have known what it was, right? The number of people who could write or had any use for writing did so for one of two major reasons. Either they did so in their official capacity as agents of the government, or as a religious leader of some kind, or something like that, right? So in an institutional capacity. Or they did so as an elite learned scholar, composing something usually for a patron of some kind. By the time of the early empire, the end of the 1st century BCE or the beginning of the 1st century CE, that patron is often the emperor, but it could be somebody else. And so a lot of these things are written with that in mind, with the desires of the patron directing the content of the document, right? And so what we're looking at here is the voice of a small fraction of the population. Now, one of the challenges we have is, the question of, can we get beyond that voice of the author and discover attitudes or values or things that were shared by a larger percentage of the population, maybe even by most Romans or most people living under Roman rule. That's always a challenge because the author's perspective is quite limited. Can we get at the voices of the plebeians? Can we get at the voices of the peasants who lived in the countryside? The answer in most cases is probably not, at least not directly. We have to speculate a great deal. One of my professors in graduate school put it this way. He said that the process of doing pre-modern history, and by that I mean ancient and medieval history, is largely an exercise in making what he called imaginative leaps. Okay, we have source material that tells us about one thing, and we have source material that tells us about another thing, and those two things may be connected in some way, or they may speak to each other. The creative historian will make an imaginative leap from the secure foundation of one source to the secure foundation of another source, and will fill in the gap with his or her imagination, right? And by imagination, I don't just mean making things up, of course. I mean, with the creativity and with sharp and penetrating historical analysis that we can find some way to flesh out the story, even if the sources don't speak directly to that. And so to study ancient history, we have to read things closely. Sometimes even go word by word. And this is one of the reasons why in this course I have us do these collaborative source commentaries. I want us to look very closely at these sources. Even to speculate, perhaps, right? To ask questions of these things, to be puzzled by them, to tease out information that is interesting and relevant to the questions that we're asking, even to asking the right questions, right? I mean, that's an important skill that students of history must develop, and one of the things that we'll focus on in this class. So, I mean, I wish that I could stop at this point and ask questions of the students here. Hopefully we can get some of those questions in the discussion boards and things like that. I hope that no one is so puzzled at this point that they just want to give up, right? But just, I want to make sure you understand that doing ancient history is an exercise in reading closely in a few sources, the few that have survived. And so in this introduction to a massive source compendium, which I have not assigned you, I would, the thing costs like $100 or something like that. We're using the McKendrick and Howe source anthology, which I think is sufficient for our purposes. But the Lewis and Reinhold collection is 2 volumes and something like 2,000 pages of Roman sources. The vast majority of the sources extant, actually, at least the most important ones. But in this introduction, the editors of this collection go through categories of sources, pretty much the categories of sources that exist from the ancient world. One thing they do not talk about here that is of import is material remains. In doing ancient history, historians and archaeologists have to work together, and often they're one and the same person. An ancient historian will need to be trained in archaeology, at least to some extent, or have an appreciation of it. In grad school, when I was studying early medieval history, which is really kind of an extension of Roman history, I read a lot of works of archaeology. Once you get into a little bit later period, into what we call the High Middle Ages, it's not so necessary, but it's really important to understand the material remains, and the editors here don't really talk about that. We will spend some time discussing material remains, especially things like architecture and burials and things like that. Especially in the very early periods, that's all we have. We don't really have any written evidence for the earliest periods of Roman history, as I'll discuss in the very next video lecture. So let me just go through this. I'm not going to, of course, read this whole 50-page introduction. You need to do that. I think it's very important for you to read this carefully. But let me just comment on some of these categories, right? So the first one that they talk about, and the one they spend the most time on, is Roman historiography. And by this, we mean the Romans writing their own history. But the thing to understand about this is that there is an institutional component to this, and then there's also limitations of genre. Okay, so history was initially composed as an official document by, as it says here at the bottom of the page, the Pontifex Maximus, who was the head of the Roman state cult of the various deities that they worshipped. And the Pontifex Maximus is an interesting figure in some ways, and we will talk about that office later on. One thing we should note is the Romans did not have any kind of separation between what we might call church and state, although those words themselves are a bit anachronistic to talk about Rome. But the Pontifex Maximus was a government official who happened to preside over religious things. And one of the duties of the Pontifex Maximus, and this goes back to the very early days of the Republic, was to keep an annal of their history, right? And this was primarily just a kind of report of the things that happened each year. They would say, this was how the harvest was. These are the wars we're fighting. These are the other major events that happened. These are the individuals who were elected to high offices in the cursus honorum, which is the system of magistrates that we'll have plenty to say about later. And they would keep a very kind of bare bones record of things, right? And so that's the institutional part of this, or that's at least the institutional foundation of Roman historiography. Later authors, really starting in about the 3rd century BCE, began to use the annals to write works of history. And history was for all ancient Roman authors, as for Greek authors for that matter, including, the great luminaries like Herodotus and Thucydides, was a genre of literature. Instead of being a poet or instead of composing works in prose, they would write history. And they saw it primarily that way. The goal was not to make an accurate record. The Annals gave a bare bones account of that. Historians in ancient Rome, as in ancient Greece, fleshed it out with their own creativity. And a couple of points that we might add to that is to note that, like the Greeks again, Roman historians tended to emphasize the deeds of great individuals. And so this is, the origin of the great man, and these were always men. Although there are some women who feature importantly in some of these stories, as we'll talk about with Livy this week and other things. Okay, so, but primarily men and their deeds, and these were, for the most part, office holders in the Roman Republic or later in the Empire, and their primary accomplishments, the significant events of their reigns, and things like that, right? And so it's connected to the deeds of individuals. So that's the first important part of this. And so they want to flesh out the deeds of the individuals. What do? Well, they do things like compose speeches to show how charismatic the individuals were. We have accounts of battles and things like that, but they are lesser in import than, these long speeches that these historians craft, probably from no record of the actual speeches given by politicians. They're just making this stuff up. Now, I mean, they have some basis in sources in the annals and things like that, but I mean, they history, as Cicero described it, is actually a form of rhetoric, right? It's an effort to put words into the mouths of historical figures that would paint them as significant and would show their accomplishments, right? So it's an exercise in rhetoric, he says. In fact, he admires history because in his mind it is the closest thing to rhetoric and oratory that we have, and Cicero was the great rhetorician and orator par excellence, right, of ancient Rome. So we can see why he was interested in this. On page 6 here, you'll see the underlined part. Thus, among the Romans, as among the Greeks, history was regarded not as a social science, meaning there is no effort to be objective with this or really even to tell things as they actually happened. That's not the sensibility. That wasn't even, a consideration with writing history in ancient Rome. And so this is not a social science, but as a branch of literature. The Greek historians and the Roman imitators, and there is a great deal of imitation. The Greeks were the ones who came up with this for the most part. The Romans, sort of held on to their coattails, and they produced some great works of history, but these were knockoffs to some extent of the Greek stuff, just like we find in poetry and other things as well. So the Greek historians and the Roman imitators were primarily literary artists, not scholars. Their efforts were dominated not by scientific methodology, but by canons of artistic form. And that's what shapes history as it was written in ancient Rome. And so, the editors here go through a list of all of the major Roman historians. And like I said, there's a finite number of these sources, right? We can list all of the major historians here in 15 pages or something like that, and give a summary of their accomplishments. The most important for our purposes, the ones we're going to spend the most time on, I wish we could do some stuff with Polybius. When I teach this as a normal semester course, I do include some readings from Polybius, but the summer term is so truncated that it's hard to do that. We will spend some time on Cicero, though Cicero is not primarily a historian. He was an orator. Many of his letters and his speeches survive, though, and these form a wonderful. They give us accounts in some cases of the events that were happening in his time. This is especially true for the times when he was serving in government offices. He was consul, for instance, which is the chief magistrate position in Rome, in the year 63 BCE, and gave a number of speeches while he was consul. There are several others that he gave, and so we have, as it says here, 864 extant letters, including 774 from Cicero himself and 90 from correspondents who were writing to Cicero or in response to him. And then we have all of these speeches. And so these are not exactly works of history, but he does describe the sequence of events there. Caesar, meaning Julius Caesar, or Gaius Julius Caesar, was not a historian in the sense of, sitting down to write a careful account of things that he passed through or things that he was interested in. He wrote propaganda for himself. He wrote these kind of dispatches from the military front during his campaigns in Gaul, and these were popular reading. This was like must-see TV, or in this case, must-read parchment, as these accounts of his great deeds fighting against the peoples of Gaul would have been considered, in the 40s, the 50s BCE, when he was fighting on these campaigns. But it does form an interesting historical source in this case. All right. Sallust is a very important one. We will spend a little time on Sallust, talking specifically about his monograph called The Eugrotine War, which is about Rome's wars in North Africa toward the end of the second century BCE, the beginning of the first century BCE, including some of the deeds of Marius and these others. He also wrote an account of the Catilinarian War, which happened during Cicero's consulship in 63 BCE. Interestingly, he doesn't have much to say about Cicero. When Cicero gives the account, he is the featured person. Sallust doesn't have a lot to say about him. So we will talk about Sallust. And Sallust, as it says here, is unique among extant Roman historians in abandoning the analytic method for the historical monograph and going for Thucydidean and realism. And, this is true. Sallust is probably the most modern in kind of his sensibilities of any of the ancient Roman historians. Now, writers of the imperial period, this is we've got a couple of really important ones here. We will spend a lot of time on Virgil. Virgil is the greatest poet of ancient Rome. His poems focus on the mythological history of very early Rome, though they do comment on more recent events at times. His masterwork, his magnum opus, was the Aeneid, though he did compose a number of other poems that have survived. Horace composed primarily lyrical poetry, though he does at times comment on the circumstances that he was living in during the reign of Augustus Caesar. And so I think it's week 4 of the course, we will look very closely at Virgil and Horace and a couple of other authors. Livy, of all the Roman historians, gives us the most material, and for many, many events, he is the only source we have. And he was a great historian in the mold of Thucydides. He wrote a history of Rome from the founding of the city to 9 BCE in 142 books. Unfortunately, there are only about 35 of these or something that are extant. And so we get a lot about Rome's very early history. This is primarily the stuff we'll be looking at in this week in class. And then we also have some stuff from the period of the Second Punic War and his accounts of Hannibal and things like that, right? Note that the editors say here, and this is an important point, his basic aim, right here, his basic aim was not critical inquiry, but moral reform through lessons to be drawn from an idealized past through emphasis on ancient virtues, heroism, patriotic sacrifice, and religious piety. In considering Livy, in fact, the first paper is on Livy, I'm asking you to discover what those are. What are the ancient virtues that he celebrates, and why does he celebrate them? And so you're going to be diving into this very quickly, and I'd be happy to help you with this. Let's talk about it in the discussion boards and in the collaborative source commentary and things like this. All right. Ovid is another one we're going to be looking at. He composed primarily poetry, including some pretty salacious erotic poetry. Kind of how-to manuals for how to win a lover and things like this. Ovid is a very interesting read, but he is an important voice from the period he comes from, and he comments on the circumstances of his life and of the Rome that he knew. And such, right? So Ovid's another important source from the period of Augustus Caesar himself. Okay. Let's see, any others that you need to read through this and try to get a sense of some of these. And if there's one who strikes you as interesting, by all means, let's talk about this, right? Let's ask questions in the discussion boards. I know something about pretty much all of these sources, or at least I can learn things about the ones I don't know much about. So let's have a conversation about these things. We will read some of the Satiric of Petronius, which is a kind of raunchy body tale. We don't know, but it's speculated that Petronius was probably a courtier of Nero, and so this is a bit after Augustus. But he he composes this poem, and hopefully you won't be too scandalized by it. But I think you could turn on the TV and probably be more scandalized with some of the things you might see there. But Petronius did write this kind of raunchy poetry, but it's a commentary and really a critique, a satire almost of what was happening during his time. I wish we had time to spend on Josephus. He's really interesting. I teach a class on Jewish history that I do spend a little more time on Josephus in that class. Plutarch is an important one. He is the source of a lot of what we know about the ancient world, even though he's writing centuries after the fact, and he's writing primarily as a moralist rather than a historian. So that's someone you should become acquainted with. We will spend some time on Tacitus, who is seen as stylistically the greatest of all the Roman historians, eclipsing even Livy and Sallust. But the one we're going to read from Tacitus is his work called the Germania, which is about the German peoples of his time. This is more a work of anthropology almost than of history, but he does try to account for the history of the people of the lands to the north of the Roman Empire at that point. We're going to read some of the letters of Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governor in Bithynia, which is in Asia Minor, what is now Turkey, and those are very interesting. These do get a little bit personal. This gives us an interior view of personal attitudes and things like this, rather than stylized. Although they are stylized, I mean, he's writing to the Emperor Trajan, and really kissing up to the emperor in some of the worst ways. I mean, this guy is a brown-noser extraordinaire, right? But he does evince some of the kind of immediate concerns of his time, so he's an interesting voice. I love Juvenal, who wrote a series of satires, and we're going to read some of his sixth satire, which is the best one, in my opinion. But Juvenal was a kind of grumpy individual who was just disgusted with, what had become of Rome during his age more than anything. But he's also has this biting, sardonic wit that is, in my opinion, hilarious to read at times. I have a quote from Juvenal on my office door, actually, about historians, and I find it very fitting. So anyway, we can talk about that later. Suetonius is one who's quite popular. He wrote a series of lives about the Caesars, about the emperors, though Suetonius is kind of like reading the National Enquirer, right? He is the tabloids of ancient Rome. It's just gossip for the most part. Apuleius is the one we're going to read at length. He did write a number of other works, but The Golden Ass is his most famous work. This is a novel. I mean, it's a fictional story, but again, it does reveal concerns of his contemporary times, specifically stuff that was going on in the provinces. He was from North Africa, and was not a resident of Rome, and so I think constitutes an important voice in that respect. Let's see, any others that I want to comment on here? I wish we had time to devote to Ammianus Marcellinus, or to some of these other late antique historians. Zosimus even is quite interesting. This does take us through some Christian sources here. The only one we're going to discuss at any length is, we will spend a little time on Eusebius. We're going to read his account of the conversion of the Emperor Constantine to Christianity. We will have some things to say about Augustine and perhaps about Jerome. These are some of the Latin church fathers. Augustine in particular is one of the great shapers of Christianity in late antiquity, probably the greatest of all Christian thinkers, maybe ever. That's not just hyperbole. I mean, Augustine is considered the greatest of all Christian minds by many. And he has a lot to say. In the classroom version of this course, I do have students read some of the City of God of Augustine toward the end of the course, but it just didn't fit with the time constraints that we have here. Okay, that was, these are the major written sources that we might call historiography, though some of these are really fiction literature, or especially with the Christian sources, theology, but they do comment on the history of their times. We also have legal sources, and I'll allow you to read through this, but in the period of the kingdom, there are some royal ordinances that have survived, and then in the very early Republic, one we're going to read this first week, is the 12 Tables. This is, these are Roman laws from the 5th century BCE, one of the earliest sources that we have extant. And so it's an important thing to comprehend if we want to understand that early period. The Romans excelled at law. This is one of the things they did extremely well. And so there's a lot of legal materials, right? We have legislation passed by the various assemblies in Rome, and I will discuss all of those assemblies at some length and describe their responsibilities and things like that later. But there are several assemblies who had legislative power in Rome, and they would issue these leges, laws, right, or plebiscita, which the plebiscita were issued, they were the resolutions of the plebeian assembly that were supposed to apply only to plebeians, but with the Lex Hortensia, or the Hortensian Law of 287 BCE, the plebiscita, the decrees of the plebeian assembly, were elevated to the position of leges, or laws. And so that's something we will discuss, and we do have a number of these extant. There are judicial edicts coming from courts. We also have, works of law that deal with the situation outside of Rome in the provinces, the Jus Gentium, as it's called, the law of peoples, or the law of nations, all of which we will have plenty to say about. Decrees of the Senate, some of these things survive. We'll talk about what the Senate is and what its role was at some length, but we do have these senatus consulta, as they're called, senatorial decrees. Some of those are extant. We also have, with the establishment of the empire, various decrees, edicts, rescripts, decreta, as they're called, and mandata, commandments. And these are different genres. These are different kinds of imperial decrees, and you can read what those are here. But starting with the reign of Augustus Caesar, we start to have that, and especially after Augustus, where the emperors kind of gain momentum and become their own institution, no longer keeping up the facade of the republic. These become more common, more frequent. Starting in about the 2nd century, but there's some antecedents to this that go all the way back into the middle period of the republic, but this becomes more common in the later empire. We have these things which are jurisprudence, right? Responsa prudentium, as they're called. Okay, so these are scholars of law who would comment on things like imperial decrees and senatorial edicts and decisions of courts and things like this. And this body of legal scholarship became an important component in the Roman legal system. These interpretations of law held weight, and government officials paid attention to these things. And it was a lot of this material that ended up being codified in the late imperial period, starting in the middle of the 3rd century CE or so, and culminating in the comprehensive compilation of law under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, called the Corpus Juris Civilis. Right, there are these codifications of Roman law. The Corpus Juris Civilis is a massive compendium of legal materials that forms the basis of law in most of the countries of the West, most European countries, and even places like the U.S. Really rests on a foundation of Roman law via the Corpus Juris Civilis. And then finally, a couple of other categories of sources that are more plentiful, but also perhaps which tell us less than these, specific written documents on parchment or papyrus. Inscriptions, meaning things carved into stone. There are over 100,000 of these. This is the one part of the source base that would not be easy to learn comprehensively. There are some fairly lengthy inscriptions. The main one we're going to read in this class is the Deeds of the Deified Augustus, okay, which is an account of the accomplishments of Augustus Caesar that he wrote or he ordered to have written at the end of his life. It's a really important piece of propaganda to try to cement the imperial position that he had crafted during his reign. After that, the other inscriptions, some of them, we're going to read Diocletian's Edict on Maximum Prices too, which is another important one. Most inscriptions are quite small and short, but from about the 3rd century BCE on, inscriptions are an important source that helps us to flesh out the life of ancient Rome in important ways. Papyri, more sources have survived in Egypt than anywhere else in what was once the Roman world. because the conditions of the desert in Egypt have allowed for papyrus documents to be preserved, mostly in jars where they were often buried or placed in climate-controlled conditions, not artificially controlled, of course, but things like caves where they could be kept dry. And given this is a desert, right, it would make sense that would happen. And so, we have thousands and thousands of papyrus documents that go all the way back to, the 3rd millennium BCE, or maybe even a little earlier than that. But a lot of this, there are thousands of these from the Roman period when Egypt was incorporated into the Roman Empire, and these can often be highly illuminating. And then finally, coins. There are Roman coins that span from Scandinavia to India, right, that have shown up in various places. Sometimes you can actually learn a lot from coins, believe it or not. They can give us important information. So, okay, that was what I wanted to do, kind of go through these sources and, try to figure out what we're looking at in this class and give you a sense of, the source material that you have at your disposal when you're trying to study ancient Roman history. If you have questions, please post them on the discussion